Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and among all these bins, there's a couple systems that have African nightcrawlers in them. Well, one of them has African nightcrawlers in them, and it's the one that's right here in front of us. It was 20 days ago that the nightcrawlers that live in this box were removed from the two different systems that they inhabited, and they were all placed into here. And then I've got another system right beneath it. And you'll notice on the label it talks about cocoons. So basically all the material that those worms had been inhabiting were placed into here with the assumption that that material was riddled with all kinds of cocoons that have yet to hatch. So both of these systems have been up here on my shelf for 20 days, and it was 9 days ago that we came in here to check on them. The nightcrawler bin itself received some food. The cocoons, I think we just checked in on them and we kind of stirred the material up, make sure everything's looking good. But after 9 days, I figured the worms might be ready for some food. And the other thing I wanted to do was use something that just arrived in the mail, which is some neem cake. Neem cake is supposed to be really good in combating mites. And for anyone who's been on my channel for a while, you'll know that for the longest time, in my African nightcrawler systems, I was battling with mites, trying everything under the sun to try to deal with them. So I wanted to make sure that these systems also get a little bit of that neem cake, which they've not yet received, just to make sure if there's mites in them, and I'm pretty sure there are, that we try to take action against them. So I'm going to get these up on the bench, and we'll get to work. So the system that we're going to begin with is the so-called cocoon nursery. It's the container that's got basically all the castings that came out of those two systems that all the worms were inhabiting previously. And the only idea here was to keep this stuff around for a little while longer with the assumption that there's a bunch of cocoons in here that are going to be hatching. And then at some point in the future, who knows how long, maybe 4 or 5 weeks or so, all the cocoons will have hatched. And we'll be left with a bunch of little baby worms. Now, I did separate the worms that are in the other system from their castings, which is what makes up most of what's in this container, using a screen. But when I did that, some worms did slip through the screen, and we're going to see some adult worms in here. And that's fine. I didn't worry too much about it. But besides those adult worms that I'm knocking off the paper right now, I'm not really sure if the camera's picking up on them or not. But I definitely see signs of some little tiny itsy bitsy worms. I mean, some of them are, probably the size of an eyelash. Where'd he go? Thought I had one right there on my fingertip. And a lot of them, do look like they're maybe a little bit older. I don't know what to equate their size to in terms of age. But a lot of them are just tiny, little itsy bitsy baby worms. So that really is kind of the theme here, that it's a cocoon nursery. And, when they come out of a cocoon, the worm is puny. I mean, really, really small. And hopefully it won't take too long for them to grow and come to the realization that the material that they're inhabiting is very limited on food. And maybe go looking for some sort of a food supply. And then over time, at some point in the near future, we're going to begin placing food items down into this edge of the bin. This edge of the bin is where I had placed a lot of the stuff other than the worms that I had collected, which didn't go through the screen. So I did my best to separate some of the stuff that the worms were inhabiting that did not go through the screen from the worms, and then we kind of put that stuff to good use over here on the edge just by plopping it in. And it's just some good worked bedding type materials. I'm sure some worms have actually made their way in there already, because it's pretty much the only game in town as far as food goes, little chunks of bedding, little chunks of leaves and food and whatnot. But like I did last week, I'm just going to take a quick tour through this material just to see how it looks. Give it a quick stir. It seems to have a pretty consistent moisture level, at least across the top. I think previously I might have left portions of it uncovered to allow it to air out and dry a bit. But as you might have noticed with the plastic that's covering it, it was covered fairly thoroughly to let it hang on to the moisture that's in it, because the moisture level is really nice. It's nice and cool and damp, but as you can see, it's not muddy or sticky or anything like that. The stuff all flows kind of like sugar. And besides doing what we're doing here, which is just inspecting the material to see how things look, like I said a moment ago, I wanted to give this a little bit of a treatment of neem oil. Not neem oil, neem cake. The neem oil that I purchased that we had been trying to battle mites with in the African nightcrawler systems just was not the right stuff. And was pretty much a waste of time and money, but this neem cake supposedly works really good. And I have to assume that this material does have a good number of mites in it. And by placing those plastic coverings over the top, any moisture that would attempt to evaporate out of this material, it all gets caught in that plastic and recirculates and creates a nice damp surface on the top, which is pretty much where I'm assuming the mites are going to congregate. I doubt that the mites would have any interest in remaining down beneath the surface. And I mean, you know, just to look at the material, it doesn't seem like it's really crawling with mites, but I guess if you slow down long enough, you do start seeing stuff moving around. So like I've been doing in some of my systems, I've got this little plastic cup here. And with the plastic cup that's got some holes in the bottom, I'm just going to dust to the top of this so that it's coated with some neem cake. And my hope is that it does what it's meant to do, which is the mites will, I believe, ingest it, and it will interfere with their ability to reproduce. And even though we've got mites in here, the next generation that would follow will be pretty much eliminated, because this stuff supposedly interferes with their ability to reproduce. So I'm just going to bring back just bring back both of these sheets of paper to rest this on briefly while I get out my little package of neem cake. Packaging says premium neem seed meal, and like I've been mentioning in the past couple videos, every time I break this stuff out, it has a pretty powerful odor to it. I'm not sure if powerful is the right word. It's got a pretty strong odor to it, and it's kind of a unique smell. But the closest thing that I could think of that it, you know, smells like is maybe onions. So I was going to spread this stuff across the top of the container here. I'm not even sure how much to use. I mean, some people talk about how they just use a couple spoonfuls, so maybe not a lot is needed. But since this is the first application of this stuff, I think I'm going to go pretty generous with it. I know what's in this little cup is definitely more than just a couple spoonfuls. So I think we'll just use all of it, spreading it out across the top. It's also my understanding that the worms really like this stuff. So I guess it's a good bite-sized type of a meal for the worms as they hatch. The little baby worms will probably enjoy it also. But I really hope that it accomplishes the mission at hand, which is the eradication of mites. So it's kind of a new thing for me. Never used this stuff before. So at the moment, the best I can do is hope. Hope for the best. Prepare for the worst. Is that what they say? I mean, when you look through the material, you gotta admit it's not bad at all. It's really nice. I don't think I'm going to use it all. It looks like I might have placed more into this little cup than is needed. So I'm going to start putting things away here. Pretty much the way we found them. I like putting these pieces of paper out on the top surface. They're sort of like a drop cloth, if you will. So so that whatever moisture gets caught by the plastic covering, it sits right there between the plastic and the paper sheet. And it makes it really easy for the worms to come up and take advantage of it. So I really like the way things look in here. The castings are beautiful. And hopefully we'll start seeing more and more baby worms. And I think we've already seen some good evidence of that here. And hopefully we'll see more of the same. So after 20 days, I would think that any cocoons that were still fairly newly deposited into the material are still awaiting the point where they're going to hatch out. Many of the cocoons that were, pretty far along already might have already hatched, and we might already have a lot of babies cruising in through here. So at some point soon, we'll begin trying to lay in some food to try to begin luring the worms out of the material. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as is. So let's go get the other bin that's got the actual worms in it. Wow, so compared to the tub that's got the castings in it, this brand new system that has the worms in it, plus pretty much just a fresh load of bedding, it's so light, so much lighter than the castings. It's amazing how heavy castings are, worm castings. So we got a whole bunch of worms really enjoying this water that's collecting on the plastic, and I guess it must be dripping right down the middle because that's where all the worms are. And it's a good thing, because in this system, I just went berserk. 20 days ago when the worms were first introduced and the system was launched off, as I mentioned earlier, I was still plagued with mites all over the place within my 2 African nightcrawler systems. So my idea for trying to intercept the mites while placing the worms into their new environment was to lay down a coating of diatomaceous earth powder, and that stuff is kind of a natural pesticide. It's a really fine material that kind of gets into the exoskeleton of insects and causes them to lose all the moisture in their bodies, and they perish as a result of that. But I had laid down so much of this stuff that the worms were just unable to pass through it down into the nice damp bedding and food and everything that was below. So when I checked on the system the day after, the poor worms were all balled up in a pile right up on the top surface. And then when we were in here last time, 9 days ago, to give this system its first feeding after the introduction of the worms, we did lay in a whole bunch of fresh leaves on the top. We sprayed in a bunch of water, and then the food that was added was also intended to add a bunch of moisture to the system as well. And I'm hoping that over time I could just, get all of this diatomaceous earth blended in so that it's no longer even visible. But since I did use so much diatomaceous earth, it might be possible that I did actually succeed in wiping out most, if not all, of the mites that were coming along for the ride with the worms. And that was my goal originally, but I guess the fallout of doing it that way was perhaps a little bit too much diatomaceous earth, or DE as we refer to it sometimes. It might be just a little bit too much DE floating around in here still. And once it does get damp like this, it's no longer even going to perform that function. It's got to remain dry, otherwise it doesn't really work as a pesticide. It's kind of cool that it's a pesticide that just works like as a physical, like little knives, little shards cutting into the insect skin without any chemicals or anything like that. So yeah, you can see it's pretty much everywhere. And that was my main objective, was just to, on every occasion when I come in here to feed the next time, just to see what I could do about blending the stuff in a little bit more. And at this point, I don't think it's going to cause the worms any concern. Just that when it was still totally dry, it was the sort of stuff that actually also absorbs moisture into itself, which kind of makes sense. but I guess I had overlooked that aspect of it. So yeah, it was a little bit of a rough start for these little guys when I first released the worms into this system. But I think now that we've already, you know, sprayed water in here and given them food, and it's been covered with plastic, everything's starting to gain a nice consistent moisture level in here, which is kind of cool. So the stuff that I need to make room for is a pretty good amount of lettuce. And you know, lettuce, it's just leafy stuff. So I mean, it looks a little bit more than usual. Usually I'll kind of provide my worm bins with about 2 handfuls of food. And I would say that this equates to about 2 handfuls, but if you look in the side, it's a lot of it's just air, where the leaves don't lay up one against the other. And it doesn't have a lot of weight to it either, so that tells me that that's a pretty, you know, normal size feeding. I've also got some coffee here, as well as the coffee filters. The filters will serve as, you know, a boost to the bedding in the system. And like I said, I've got the NEEM cake we're going to include along with the food. Even though I don't even know if there's still a mite situation in here, I guess it's almost like a preventative thing at this point. It's funny too, because if this is in fact now a mite-free environment, this was really the population that was initially the first one that I noticed was really experiencing a problem with sort of a breakout of mites. And maybe this last attempt using the diatomaceous earth while releasing the worms into their new environment, while as, you know, as much as it was becoming a really uncomfortable situation for the worms to endure all that, if it had accomplished the task at hand, which was to wipe out the mites, then I believe it was worth the sacrifice of making the worms endure that discomfort. It's kind of cool. The worms are kind of all hanging out down where the feeding had been added last time. And I definitely see, you know, little bits and pieces of things, like there was a coffee filter that looked like it might have still had some coffee left in it. I don't remember what kind of foods were placed in here other than the coffee, but I believe that this is also just some leftover coffee still sitting within its coffee filter. But whatever it is that was placed in here as food may have been depleted over the past 9 days, because I don't really see many signs of it, if any. So that's cool. I'm glad we're coming in here. It seems like a good timely interval to be feeding these little guys. Like I said earlier, I was actually retiring 2 systems, so it's actually the worms out of 2 separate systems that had been placed into here. So we do have a pretty good size population of worms in here. Thinking maybe as sort of a foundation for the feeding, we could recycle some of those larger chunks of cardboard that were floating around up top. Looks like some of them might even have some mold growing on them, which the worms are totally into, so it's not a problem. So let's bring in the food. You can see that this stuff this stuff was found down in the crisper at my mom's house. I guess she kind of lost track of the fact that she had a package of lettuce down in there. So you can see that the decomposition process had already started on this stuff. I brought it home from my mom's house last night, and I did place it in the freezer overnight, so it did have a chance to freeze a little bit, it seems. I don't know, certain things just seem like they don't really freeze that much, or maybe they just thaw really quickly. Not sure why, but it doesn't seem as hard and crispy and crunchy as most things that I freeze for the worms. So the stuff I'm powdering in here now is crushed eggshell. Since it's a fairly new bin, I want to make sure that I'm providing grit, and the eggshell is what I use as grit. And what else do we have here? I've got coffee, as well as the filters from the coffee. So we'll just kind of bust up these filters and spread the coffee out over the top of that. So it's definitely a pretty generous looking feeding. But like I said earlier, I think the lettuce just sort of takes up a little bit more space because it's just like a sort of a light and airy material. So I'm going to treat the food itself with a little bit of the neem cake. And then I think I'll kind of put a coating of it across the top surface as well. All this diatomaceous earth everywhere. Maybe I should do what I did last time too, which is provide the whole bin with a nice fresh coating of leaves across the top. I do have some leaves over here on the side. There's always no harm in adding more bedding to your worm bins. You can never go wrong with more bedding. It'll just give the worms more and more space to be able to roam. So let me go grab that too, and we'll place that out across the top as well. So it certainly isn't a whole lot, but we'll just place it all in here just to give it that sort of nice natural appearance across the top surface instead of chunks of cardboard everywhere and white powder. Totally cosmetic. It certainly doesn't matter. If all you do is give the worms of your system paper and cardboard, they'll be just as happy, I think. So let's see, I've still got a little bit of this neem cake here to spread out, so why don't we just go ahead and apply it to the top surface here. Like I said, this system may very well have already had its mite population wiped out by the diatomaceous earth, but I don't want to leave much to chance. I mean, I've got this neem cake and I'm going to use it, and I'm going to use it liberally. And if it works, that's great. It might just become a staple item in my feedings to include in all my worm bins. Although, you know, maybe at some point if the mite situation does come under control, maybe I could ease up on its use, or maybe even stop using it, because it does have a little bit of a pungent odor. I'd prefer not to use it if I didn't have to, but it does feel like I've got to come up with some sort of a plan to deal with the mites. And if this stuff works as advertised, then I'll be really tickled pink, because it'll be the end of a long road of dealing with mites in my systems for quite some time now. Oh, I got a phone call coming in, so let me just really quickly cover up here and bid you farewell. I'll just give that person a call back really quick after I say goodbye. But before I say goodbye, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too if you haven't done so already. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.